Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Split, a young adult book review podcast for readers and writers. Dancing over there in Australia is Robert Scanlon, the author of the Dreamer Chronicles. I'm Bryan Cohen, the author of the Ted Saves the World series. I hear it's been hot in Australia.
We could send you some of our heat if you like, Bryan. I'm sure you're needing some in Chicago there.
We are. It's below 0 Celsius these days. We're cold. Please send your heat, your donations of heat to us. They should do that. They should find a way to do that.
That would have been pretty neat, wouldn't it, if we had heat conductors we could
cool.
just shift around the world.
Yeah. I think that would be fantastic. One might even say that would be peculiar.
It would, wouldn't it?
This week, we are going to talk about Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children by Ransom Riggs. And this was a really cool book. It was really interesting. I gotta say, I've already been chastised because I listened to the audio version, like I do with everything. But I've been chastised for not having the book and the pictures, the very cool pictures throughout. I've obviously looked up some of them since then, but anyway, let me describe this book, then we'll get into the readers, the writers, the takeaways, and the prompt of the week. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right, cool. 16-year-old Jacob stopped believing in his grandfather Abe's tales years ago, despite the strange photos of children with peculiar abilities. When Abe dies, seemingly at the hands of a vicious creature, Jacob must journey to a remote island off the coast of Wales. When he comes upon a dilapidated house with similar photographs, Jacob digs deeper and finds a lot more than he ever thought possible. Love and war await in a tale that transcends time itself. Whoa. So, I know, right? That sounds like a good book. I'm glad I read it. This book's something. I mean, it's got everything. Monsters, time travel, the Welsh. It really has it all. But seriously, there's a lot to it. And it really kept me engaged throughout. I love that so many of our characters are flawed. No one's a straightaway hero that comes in and saves the day. All the heroes are a little bit and the villains seem like they maybe have some sympathy there. And the magic behind the peculiar children has some darkness to it. I think that even though it's pitched to the Harry Potter audience, it's darker, more vulgar, a little scarier at times. But, I mean, that's obviously no reason not to pick it up. It's really good, and I really enjoyed the story that Ransom Riggs told on this one. Take the floor, Robert.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned the vulgarity because I was recommended this book by a good friend of mine who is actually the head library teacher at one of the local schools in the primary area, and I did wonder whether she had it in stock in the primary section because I think it's too vulgar for the middle grade audience, and so I would recommend probably 13 and above. There is some slang there, which are it's sexual content. My daughter read the book. I did before I did because it was recommended. She's 11, and I asked her about it, and she said, "Well, I didn't understand them, so it didn't mean anything to me." And that's true because they're slang, but nonetheless, I didn't think it was appropriate. So that's worth noting for those who need to know such things. Interesting, you talked about it being dark as well and flawed characters. This is reputedly going to be a Tim Burton movie, I believe, and it really is ideally suited to that. It's got the perfect dark and stormy night setting. There are storms, there's war, there's flawed characters, as you say. But this may be where we're going to be a little split here because it just didn't light me up. This book, I found that it just was in need of a huge development developmental edit. I felt there were,
Really?
yeah. The premise was really good, and the time loop I think is extremely well done, and the reason for the time loop is plausible. The reason for why the people exist who are in the time loop was. Yeah, and your point is, and also I thought that the peculiar kids, the peculiar refers to peculiar powers maybe that they have, I suppose, or magic,
Sure.
seemed to me to be, I don't know, just spurious, random things that may or may not have had something to do with the plot. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. And one of the things that I really did not like was how quickly the emotional content changed for no reason at all. Characters are suddenly flipped from being angry to being happy, and they'd have just had a massive fight where they'd all just escaped death, and then all of a sudden they're talking and planning about the next thing rather than being shaken in their boots and kind of stirred up. So it wasn't really so much the storyline as the execution, I think for me, and you know me, I can be a bit of a tough critic in that respect.
Oh, sure.
I'd certainly love to see it made as a movie. I mean, but from a traditionally published point of view, there's often criticism of the independent published world that stories are in need of a developmental edit. Well, I would hold this up as a traditionally published version that could have been improved for sure, and had some serious gaps in there. The conflict was not, the tension in the conflict was not, I don't know, just didn't build up enough.
I agree
there are fantastic action sequences, no question about that.
Yeah. One thing I agree about with your critique is that the main conflict of the book didn't happen until really the last third.
Yeah.
And I thought I could definitely see how that would put some people off for sure. But as we move into the writer's perspective, I was listening to an interview on the Creative Pen with David Farland, the author of $1 Million Outline.
Yes, I heard that.
And he says that the best books transport us to another place.
Yes.
The books that are the most successful. And Miss Peregrine's does that twice over.
Yes.
First, by transporting us to an island off the coast of Wales, and second, by taking us back in time.
Yes.
When you add in that conceit of the vintage photographs and giving the readers another reason to get involved, I mean, I agree that the book dragged at times, but you've got so much there between the transporting us to another place and the photos and the powers. I saw a lot of reviews that referred to this as like kind of X-Men First Class, that movie with the younger versions of the X-Men. I mean, there's a lot there for people to like, but
yes.
I mean, I don't disagree. I would have loved the conflict to be a little bit earlier, and there was definitely one point where I noticed, okay, so they just have this big fight after Jacob goes snooping around and in Emma's stuff, and the next day they're fine. That I agree. There could have been maybe a little bit of residual. But then again, maybe these people in the loop, there was a mention that the people in the loop, by the virtue of being in that magic, kind of let things brush off their shoulder a little more. There was a mention to that, but I don't know if that's like a getting away with lighter emotional stakes sort of line, but I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting that you make the observation for the interview with Joanna and David, because I listened to that too, and that was one of the things that really struck me as well was the transportation and making your story wondrous. And I think that's probably what made me finish this book, is it was still wondrous enough that it did transport. And the other thing is that I recently saw an email come through, an email newsletter, and it was talking about the 4 typical flaws that you find in characters. And one of those is that characters make inconsistent or things that you can't rationalize that are not consistent with their character so far. And so maybe you've got a villain who always robs houses at night, and then all of a sudden at the end, they rob a house during the day with no explanation at all. And the only reason is so they can get caught. And so it flaws the storyline. And so for me, there were, as you just mentioned, with that, well, it could have been because, these are kids. Some of these kids are sort of 80 to over 100 years old because they've been in this one-day time loop for a long time. And so maybe over time, they have these strange emotional quirks. And if you could have baked that into the story a little bit more, then I would have said, oh, okay, I get it now. I understand, why
we see it developing or we see it in action more, it makes sense.
Yeah, or Jacob questioning it as well.
That would help because he's our straight man. He's our normal person thrust into all of this.
And one more thing as well is that if you're an author and you're writing in another land, I know the Welsh reasonably well, and it just did not feel like they were Welsh people. They sounded mostly like Cockneys to me. And so there was some colloquialism in there. And one really, really, really hilarious one where there's an English expression, which I'm sure you know, and it's an Australian one as well, where if you're teasing someone and you're taking the mickey out of them, then a slightly more vulgar version of that might be you're taking the piss out of somebody. And the author got it wrong. And the author said it was taking a piss. Now, taking a piss is urinating. So, and it's 3 times in the book, and my daughter picked it up as well, and we were in fits over it. It was hilarious. That
is so funny.
And it kicks you out in one sentence, kicks you out of the story. So an editor should have picked that up. So that was one of my first clues about. I don't know about the editing on this. It could have been done better. But look,
it's
still a good read. I wouldn't say, for me, it wasn't like Divergent where I just hated it. Not at all. It was a good read and a good premise, as you say.
One thing I was interested in, I was looking at their cover page, and it's a Philadelphia publisher called Quirk Books. I don't know if that's an imprint of a bigger company, or if it's a smaller company that kind of had their book that could, their little book that could. It could be a subsidiary of a big five, but if it's not, I mean, that could potentially explain maybe some of the editing shortcomings, and it really goes to show how awesome it is that it became such a big hit. But I don't know. Well, need to do more research.
Yeah, in Australia, it'll be a Trad published distributed book, that's for sure. They may have picked it up from a small press because it's in libraries. I read mine from the library, and I was shown a physical copy at the primary school library when I was recommended it. And and it's funny enough, my daughter started reading it, and then she came running down and says, "Daddy, I've actually already read this. You read so many books, you sometimes forget." It's already read it.
That's so funny.
Like a year ago. But you mentioned the photos, and that is actually a really clever part of the story. The Jacob and the grandfather often refer to these vintage photos where there are some slightly unusual things, where there's a baby floating up the top of a door frame, for example. And so if you do get a chance to pick up a physical copy of the book, then you will be rewarded with these wonderful photos throughout the book, and also credited and explained at the end. So, yeah.
I will have to do that. For sure. You're giving me something. How about you take something away?
Yeah, okay. I'll go with my takeaway. So for me, I suppose one of the first things, and I mentioned it before, is that some of the peculiar abilities which provided great interest in the story, some of them just seem to be flights of fancy, and they were insufficiently explained from my point of view. So, why did the boy have bees living in his stomach? And they didn't really ever do anything other than cause an annoyance. So if that were me as a developmental editor, I'd say, can that character be combined with another? What's the purpose? So it's the old Chekhov thing, isn't it? If there's a sword on the wall in Act 1, then it's got to do something in Act 3. Or, if a gun is introduced in Act 1, then the gun has to fire in Act 3. So for me, there was a lot that could have been done. And one of the takeaways is I wanted more to happen. And so I'd love to see an author, or this author even, and I think
there is a sequel.
The sequel is waiting for me at the library. Yeah, the Hollow Cities or something.
Hollow Town or Hollow City. You're right. You're
right. So yeah, who knows? We all grow and develop as writers, and I'm sure if we reviewed. If somebody else were to review either of our first books, they'd probably find some things in there that were...
I have some good reviews.
It might be flaws.
For sure.
And you can only learn. And if you are writing, then for sure, the aim should be to always make your craft better. So before I make myself sound like some snobby critic, I would apply the same fierce blowtorch to my own work.
Yep, same.
So,
same.
Bryan, do you have a takeaway? Maybe a positive one.
I have a takeaway. I wanna give you a life raft, and my takeaway is something I mentioned earlier. Transport your readers somewhere. It's something I'd really like to do in some of my future books, and it's given me some ideas for when I finish the TED series, my next series, which I already know what it is. Setting that in a more exotic locale will definitely, I think it'll help the series. It'll help its chances for people getting excited about it. So transport your readers somewhere, and you'll probably be rewarded for it.
Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway from this book. Even though I might be critical of some of the delivery, it does transport you. There's no question about that, and it does it very well. There's good description in there. My third takeaway would be that it's along the lines of the wondrous thing, transporting, that, don't be afraid to stir in peculiar characters, as long as you make them part of the story. But by all means, this author managed to stir in lots of peculiarity in there, and it did make it an interesting read. From a helicopter point of view, I'd say, okay, so why some of them? But for the most part, it was kind of cool that you had, kids who could make a plant grow instantly, and kids who could float in the air, So I won't reveal any more. I think you should go read the book. But
go read the book.
Part of the wonder and the transportation can be in what the characters can do as well, and you wouldn't necessarily call them superheroes. So I like the idea that they had peculiar powers, and I'm looking forward to reading the sequel to find out more about that, and why this age-old war between these special, humans who have these powers that others don't, why that's happening. Yeah.
I am interested to read the sequel as well. I feel like we've got a lot of sequels queued up for us to read in the future, for sure. I'm
actually currently reading The Whispering Skull, which is a sequel to Lockwood & Co.'s Screaming Staircase, and it's fantastic. Nice. It's really good.
Oh, I'm not surprised at all. All right, I've got a prompt.
You must have a prompt. You must.
I must have a prompt. I'm keeping it general for this one.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine that you saw a person do something you couldn't explain. How would you react? During a crisis, do you think you'd trust this person to protect you with his or her abilities? Why or why not?
Ooh, that is nicely broad, isn't it? So, you could go paranormal, or you could just go with, I don't know why they did what they did.
Yeah.
I like it. Yeah.
Thank you. If you have a response to that, post it in the comments below on either YouTube or the splitbookreviews.com. And you can also email us and, I don't know, send it to us in tweets. We're going to have all this stuff set up. You're going to be able to contact us in bunches of ways. We still haven't released this as of the moment that we're posting this, but it will be episode 11 if we go in order. So, very exciting stuff. This was another Robert recommendation. But I had heard of it. I had wanted to.
Well, I have
to
say, the cover was great. It is a really good cover. It is, and the title. So the title is intriguing. So
yeah, very much so. Very much so. Cool. Well, we're done with this episode. This was The Split, and we are so glad you could be here. That's Robert Scanlon of the Dreamer Chronicles. I'm Bryan Cohen of Ted Saves the World. Please come back every week. We'll have new, awesome, hopefully, I mean, we think it's awesome content for you to watch, and hopefully you'll learn some good books to either read or emulate going forward. Bye for now.
Ciao.
Thank you guys for watching. Somewhere on this page is a subscribe button to the Split channel. We do reviews every week. We would love it if you followed us every single week. Isn't that right, Robert?
That's exactly right. Follow us now. Hit the subscribe button.
Do it.